Police examined this property more than once, yet nothing at first glance appeared out of place. On a quiet street in an English town, daily life followed a familiar rhythm. Vans passed in the early morning, neighbors left for work, and local shops opened their shutters on schedule. The area was unremarkable in every visible way. Small businesses operated nearby, paperwork was filed on time, and customers came and went without drawing attention. It was the kind of setting where routine blends into background noise and where nothing seems to demand closer inspection. Records indicate that one of the units along this street was registered as a modest commercial operation. It had the appearance of legitimacy, a registered address, invoices, and a presence that fit neatly into the local economy. Staff arrived during working hours, deliveries were received, and no complaints were recorded by neighbors. To an outside observer, it functioned exactly as expected. The question at that early stage was simple: why would such a place attract even brief attention from authorities? The answer did not come quickly, and it did not arrive with certainty. It emerged gradually through routine checks and administrative processes that rarely make headlines. Authorities conducting standard financial monitoring noted activity that, while not unlawful on its own, did not entirely align with the stated nature of the business. The amounts were not dramatic, the frequency not alarming. Still, the pattern raised a quiet question: did these transactions fully reflect the work being done? At first, the matter remained low priority. Businesses vary in structure, and financial flows are often uneven. There was no reason to assume wrongdoing, and no immediate action followed. Yet, as months passed, similar patterns appeared again. Records showed repeated movements of funds connected to the same cluster of individuals. Each instance taken alone seemed explainable. Together, they suggested a consistency that was difficult to ignore. Around the same time, customs data unrelated to the original review began to intersect with these financial records. Authorities noticed shipments moving through established routes, documented correctly and without incident. Nothing in the paperwork suggested irregularity. The contents were declared, the destinations expected. Still, analysts noted the recurrence of certain names and businesses across different datasets. It prompted another question: was this coincidence or part of a broader structure not yet visible? In the community, nothing appeared to change. The street remained calm, employees continued their routines, and customers interacted as usual. There were no visible signs of investigation, no disruption to daily life. This contrast between outward normalcy and quiet administrative interest underscored the nature of the early inquiry. It was not driven by suspicion, but by curiosity grounded in records and timelines. Authorities approached the matter with restraint. No labels were applied and no assumptions were made about intent. Individuals connected to the business were noted only as names in documents, linked by transactions and registrations. Their backgrounds were not a focus at this stage. The emphasis remained in understanding whether the data told a coherent story. As part of routine oversight, financial summaries were reviewed over a longer period. When viewed in sequence, certain movements appeared unusually consistent. Funds entered accounts, moved through expected channels, and exited in ways that were technically compliant. Yet the overall flow did not fully match the scale or scope of the declared business activity. This discrepancy was subtle, but it persisted. Another layer of review examined international links. Records showed lawful transfers and documented connections to overseas locations commonly associated with global commerce. Again, there was nothing inherently improper about this. Many UK businesses operate internationally. The question was not where the money went, but why these connections appeared so frequently and with such regularity. At this point, authorities noted that several individuals associated with the records shared overlapping roles across different entities. Some were listed as directors, others as representatives. These roles changed over time, but the names remained familiar. This pattern did not suggest wrongdoing, but it did suggest coordination. Analysts asked quietly, were these roles independent or part of an organized arrangement? Throughout this period, communication between departments remained formal and limited. Information was shared only as necessary, ensuring accuracy and compliance with legal standards. No operational steps were taken, and no conclusions were drawn. The focus remained in observation, documentation, and verification. As the review continued, one small detail stood out. During a routine inspection of commercial records, authorities identified a discrepancy between declared business activity and the physical scale of operations. The volume of administrative movement appeared greater than what the premises could reasonably support. This did not indicate illegality, but it did raise a practical question about capacity and purpose. That question led to a minor but notable discovery. Among standard documentation, an entry referenced goods packaging that did not align clearly with the stated business model. The reference was brief and easily overlooked, yet it suggested that the materials handled on-site might serve a function beyond what was publicly declared. It was not evidence of wrongdoing, and it did not trigger immediate action, but it was enough to warrant a closer look. For the first time, authorities acknowledged that beneath the ordinary appearance of this quiet street and its routine operations, there might be connections that required careful, structured attention. For the first time, authorities acknowledged that beneath the ordinary appearance of this quiet street and its routine operations, there might be connections that required careful, structured attention. That acknowledgement did not lead to immediate action. Instead, it marked a shift in how existing information was reviewed. Analysts returned to records already examined, this time placing greater emphasis on sequence rather than detail. Dates were aligned, transactions were grouped by frequency, and movements were viewed across longer time frames. What emerged was not a single irregular event, but a pattern that appeared repeatedly without a clear commercial explanation. One of the earliest observations concerned timing. Records indicate that financial activity tended to rise and fall in cycles that did not correspond with seasonal demand or typical business fluctuations. These cycles appeared steady and predictable, suggesting planning rather than chance. Still, no assumption was made about intent. Businesses can experience irregular rhythms for many legitimate reasons. The task at this stage was simply to document what was observable. As this review progressed, attention widened to include individuals associated with the operation. They were introduced into the analysis cautiously as names linked to paperwork rather than as subjects of suspicion. Some appeared as company directors, others as authorized contacts or logistics coordinators. Over time, roles shifted, yet the same small group of individuals remained connected to multiple entities. This continuity raised a quiet question: why did responsibility circulate within such a limited circle? Behavioral patterns were also noted. Travel records showed regular movement between specific locations, often aligned with financial cycles already identified. These journeys were lawful and properly documented. On their own, they were unremarkable. When viewed alongside transaction timelines, however, they appeared synchronized. Authorities asked whether this alignment was coincidental or indicative of coordination. Another area of review involved declared business activities. Documentation described services that were broad in scope but limited in physical scale. When analysts compared this description with the volume of administrative activity recorded, an imbalance became apparent. The paperwork suggested a level of throughput that exceeded what the premises could reasonably support. Again, this was not treated as evidence of wrongdoing, but it did add to the growing list of unexplained inconsistencies. International links became more prominent during this phase. Records showed frequent financial connections with overseas locations commonly associated with global trade and commerce. Such links are not unusual for UK-based businesses. However, the regularity and structure of these transfers prompted closer examination. Authorities noted that amounts were divided into smaller sums and routed through multiple entities before reaching their final destination. This method was documented without interpretation, simply as a factual observation. Communication patterns were reviewed in a similarly restrained manner. Analysts did not examine content, focusing instead on frequency and timing. Certain contacts appeared repeatedly across different periods, often coinciding with financial and travel activity. These links suggested coordination across roles and locations, though no conclusions were drawn about purpose. The emphasis remained on correlation, not causation. Throughout this stage, authorities were careful to avoid language that implied suspicion or guilt. Internal notes described findings as unexplained rather than irregular, and patterns rather than methods. Each observation was accompanied by caveats, acknowledging alternative explanations and the limitations of available data. This discipline reflected an awareness of the consequences that premature judgment can carry. As weeks passed, analysts began to map relationships visually, using timelines and charts to illustrate how individuals, entities, and locations intersected. These tools were not used to prove a theory, but to clarify complexity. When viewed this way, certain connections became easier to see. Names that had appeared sporadically now formed consistent links. Transactions that seemed isolated aligned into sequences. The picture remained incomplete, but it was becoming more coherent. Meanwhile, the community remained unaware of these developments. The business continued to operate openly, and no visible changes occurred at the property. This contrast reinforced the investigative approach. The work was administrative and analytical, unfolding quietly within regulatory frameworks rather than through enforcement activity. During a routine internal briefing, analysts presented an updated overview. It summarized the observed patterns without interpretation, outlining timelines, overlaps, and points requiring further clarification. The presentation was deliberately cautious. No accusations were made, and no recommendations for action were issued. Instead, it posed questions. Why did these cycles repeat? Why did the same individuals appear across unrelated entities? Why did declared activity not align neatly with recorded movement? Senior officials reviewed the material with the same restraint. They requested further verification, emphasizing accuracy over speed. Additional datasets were consulted to confirm that observations were consistent and not the result of incomplete information. This step reinforced the principle that patterns must be robust before they can justify closer scrutiny. As the verification process continued, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to avoid. The convergence of financial cycles, repeated associations, and international links suggested a level of organization that exceeded routine business complexity. Authorities remained careful in their wording, but internally acknowledged that the matter could no longer be treated as a series of unrelated observations. The moment was not dramatic. There was no single discovery that changed everything. Instead, it was the accumulation of small, consistent details that led officials to reassess their approach. What had begun as routine monitoring now appeared to warrant structured investigative attention, guided by formal oversight and legal safeguards. At the end of this phase, officials agreed on one point. While no conclusions had been reached and no actions taken, the consistency of the patterns observed meant that continued passive review would be insufficient. The situation required closer attention, not because wrongdoing had been proven, but because unanswered questions had grown too numerous to ignore.
That recognition set the conditions for a broader review, one that extended beyond the initial records and locations already examined. Authorities expanded their scope carefully, ensuring that each step remained proportionate and supported by legal guidance. The aim was not to accelerate outcomes, but to understand whether the patterns observed were limited in reach or part of a wider structure operating across multiple jurisdictions. Administrative requests were the first step. Additional datasets were consulted through established channels, allowing analysts to compare findings without relying on a single source. These reviews included corporate registrations, compliance filings, and historical summaries that could provide context to the timelines already identified. Each request was logged and justified, reflecting a commitment to transparency and oversight. As these materials were consolidated, it became clear that the activity under review was not confined to one town or one address. Records indicated connections to other parts of the UK, where similarly registered entities appeared briefly before changing status or representation. On paper, these changes were lawful. Businesses open and close regularly, and directorships change for many reasons. However, the recurrence of familiar names across different locations suggested coordination that extended beyond local circumstances. To manage this growing complexity, authorities adjusted their internal structure. Separate teams were assigned to review specific regions, each working independently but reporting into a central coordination unit. This approach ensured consistency while allowing local context to inform interpretation. Findings were shared through summaries rather than raw data, reducing the risk of misinterpretation and maintaining focus on patterns rather than detail. Legal advisors played a central role during this phase. They reviewed the basis for continued information gathering and confirmed that the expanding scope remained justified. Their guidance ensured that investigative activity stayed within statutory limits and respected individual rights. This legal oversight was not a formality. It shaped how information was requested, reviewed, and stored, reinforcing the principle that process matters as much as outcome. Intelligence gathering during this period was deliberately non-technical. Analysts focused on what records indicated rather than how information was obtained. Summaries described frequency, timing, and association in plain terms. For example, they noted how certain entities appeared briefly in records before being replaced by others with similar characteristics, or how financial connections aligned across regions without a clear commercial rationale. These observations were documented as facts, not interpretations. As the scope widened, international links became more prominent. Authorities observed lawful transfers connected to overseas destinations associated with global trade. Such connections were common in legitimate commerce, but their consistency across multiple entities prompted further documentation. Analysts compared timelines across borders, noting where sequences aligned or repeated. Again, no assumptions were made about purpose. The emphasis remained on understanding structure rather than inferring intent. Interagency communication increased, though it remained measured and formal. Information was shared through established frameworks designed to protect accuracy and accountability. Each contribution was reviewed before being integrated into the central assessment. This cooperative approach allowed authorities to build a clearer picture without relying on any single perspective. One notable development during this phase was the identification of intermediary entities. These organizations appeared to serve transitional roles, connecting otherwise unrelated records. Their presence helped explain how activity could move across locations without drawing attention. On paper, these entities complied with registration requirements. In practice, their brief existence and repeated similarity raised questions that were carefully noted for further review. Throughout this expansion, restraint remained evident. Authorities avoided language that suggested certainty or wrongdoing. Internal documents continued to describe findings as unexplained or requiring clarification. Supervisory reviews ensured that analytical methods remained consistent and that alternative explanations were considered. This discipline preserved the integrity of the investigation as it grew in scale. The growing body of information prompted a series of internal briefings at a higher level. These sessions focused on governance rather than action. Officials were presented with summaries outlining what was known, what remained unclear, and what risks existed in either advancing or delaying further steps. The tone remained factual, underscoring that the work was ongoing and conclusions had not been reached. During one such briefing, a consolidated overview brought together regional findings for the first time. When viewed side by side, timelines that had seemed unrelated aligned with greater clarity. Entities previously treated as peripheral now appeared central when placed in sequence. The network-like nature of the activity became more apparent, not as a single operation, but as a series of connected arrangements adapting over time. This realization marked a significant shift. Authorities understood that the matter was no longer about assessing isolated irregularities or regional anomalies. It had become an inquiry into how a coordinated structure could operate across locations while maintaining an appearance of routine compliance. That understanding did not trigger immediate enforcement, but it did alter priorities. The investigation was now framed as a connected case requiring heightened coordination, formal oversight, and preparation for the next phase of legal and procedural scrutiny.
That broader involvement altered the rhythm of the inquiry. What had once been a limited review now operated within a defined legal framework with clear boundaries and documented responsibilities. Oversight increased not as a sign of urgency, but as a safeguard. Senior officers reviewed progress at set intervals, ensuring that each step remained proportionate and justified. The emphasis was no longer on speed, but on accuracy. Pressure began to build through procedure rather than presence. Requests for records were issued formally and logged carefully. Financial summaries were revisited with greater scrutiny, often by separate teams working independently of one another. This separation was deliberate. It reduced the risk of confirmation bias and ensured that conclusions rested on corroborated information rather than assumption. Where discrepancies appeared, they were flagged without interpretation, left open until further context could be established. Coordination across departments became routine. Analysts, compliance specialists, and legal advisors met regularly to assess progress. These discussions were methodical. Each meeting followed a structured agenda, focusing first on what was known, then on what remained unclear. Speculation was discouraged. If a question could not be answered with evidence, it was recorded as unresolved and returned to later. This disciplined approach slowed the pace, but it strengthened the integrity of the process. Legal safeguards shaped every decision. Before any further steps were taken, advisors reviewed whether thresholds had been met. The goal was not to advance the case at all costs, but to ensure that any action would withstand scrutiny if examined in court. This meant revisiting earlier material repeatedly. Some records were checked 3 or 4 times, sometimes reaching the same conclusion, sometimes not. Each outcome was documented. As the review deepened, patterns began to align more clearly. Timelines that once appeared coincidental started to show consistency. Movements between locations followed a rhythm that was not immediately obvious, but statistically unusual. Authorities did not characterize these findings as evidence of wrongdoing. Instead, they noted them as indicators requiring explanation. The distinction mattered. It preserved neutrality while allowing the inquiry to continue. External cooperation added another layer of complexity. Requests for assistance were made to agencies responsible for border controls, financial monitoring, and regulatory compliance. Information returned through these channels arrived slowly and often incomplete. Some data required clarification, some raised further questions. Each response was assessed independently before being integrated into the wider picture. Nothing was treated as definitive on its own. Throughout this phase, restraint remained central. No individuals were approached directly. No public statements were issued. Even within official circles, access to the full case was limited. Only those with a defined role could review the complete file. This compartmentalization reduced risk and protected the rights of those involved, particularly at a stage where conclusions were still forming. The pressure was felt most keenly in the documentation. Reports grew longer, not because events were dramatic, but because every inference required explanation. Analysts were required to show how each conclusion had been reached and which alternatives had been considered. Where uncertainty remained, it was stated clearly. This transparency was intentional. It ensured that future decisions would be traceable back to their origins. As months passed, patience became as important as persistence. Some leads reached dead ends and were closed without hesitation. Others remained open, revisited only when new information became available. This selective approach prevented the inquiry from expanding unnecessarily while allowing it to remain responsive. The aim was focus, not breadth. Then, during a routine cross-check intended simply to confirm an earlier assumption, records revealed an inconsistency that could not be reconciled with existing explanations.
A transaction previously thought to be peripheral appeared in multiple, unrelated datasets, each from a different source. Individually, none of these entries seemed significant. Taken together, they pointed to a connection that had not been recognized before, quietly shifting the direction of the entire investigation.
That newly identified connection prompted a careful reassessment rather than an immediate response. Authorities paused to ensure that the implications were fully understood and properly contextualized. Legal advisors reviewed whether the accumulated material met the necessary standards to move beyond review and into formal action. Only after this confirmation did the process advance, guided by established procedures rather than momentum. Decisions were taken collectively and recorded in detail. Warrants and notices were prepared with attention to scope and proportionality, reflecting the principle that enforcement must be precise. When arrests followed, they were conducted without public display and in accordance with established safeguards. Individuals were informed of their rights, and the process unfolded within the boundaries of the law. There was no rush to characterize events. Official statements, when issued, were factual and limited to confirmed outcomes. Court proceedings developed over time, shaped by schedules and disclosure requirements. The focus remained on documentation, records, timelines, and the consistency of information gathered from multiple sources. Prosecutors presented their case in measured terms, outlining how the investigation had progressed and why certain conclusions had been reached. Defense representatives examined the same material, testing its reliability and interpretation. The court's role was not to react to headlines, but to weigh evidence carefully. Throughout the hearings, emphasis was placed on accountability rather than spectacle. The court considered whether legal obligations had been breached, and if so, to what extent. Where responsibility was established, it was framed within the context of regulatory and criminal law, not moral judgment. The process underscored a central principle of the justice system. Outcomes are determined by evidence and procedure, not assumption. Judgments reflected this approach. The court outlined its reasoning clearly, referencing the standards applied and the factors considered. Sentences, where imposed, were explained in terms of deterrence, proportionality, and public interest. Financial penalties and custodial terms were accompanied by orders designed to prevent recurrence, reinforcing the idea that consequences extend beyond punishment alone. These measures were intended to disrupt harmful activity while signaling the seriousness of compliance failures. Official outcomes also included the formal recovery of funds linked to unlawful activity. This aspect of the resolution was addressed with particular care, as it involved tracing and verification. Authorities emphasized that such recoveries serve a broader purpose, restoring confidence in financial systems and reducing the incentive for misuse. Public communication around these actions remained restrained, focusing on confirmed facts rather than narrative. For the institutions involved, the case marked the conclusion of a lengthy process, but not an endpoint. Internal reviews followed, examining how the investigation had been conducted and whether improvements could be made. These assessments were not about assigning blame within agencies, but about learning. Documentation practices, interagency coordination, and oversight mechanisms were all evaluated to identify strengths and gaps. Community impact was considered in parallel. Authorities acknowledged that such cases can generate concern and uncertainty, particularly when they involve complex financial matters. Outreach efforts focused on reassurance, emphasizing that the resolution demonstrated the system working as intended. The message was consistent. Vigilance and lawful process are essential to maintaining trust. As proceedings concluded, records were archived and access restricted according to policy. What remained was a detailed account of how an ordinary setting had become the focus of sustained scrutiny, and how that scrutiny had been resolved through lawful means.
The case did not end with dramatic closure, but with a clearer understanding of responsibility, a reaffirmation of legal standards, and the recognition that accountability is an ongoing obligation rather than a single moment.
The conclusion of the court proceedings marked the end of formal action, but the story extended well beyond the courtroom. In the months that followed, the community gradually absorbed the implications of the case. For many residents and local businesses, the revelation that ordinary commercial premises had been linked to a structured and complex financial investigation prompted reflection rather than fear. Daily life continued, yet there was a renewed awareness of the systems that operate quietly in the background, ensuring compliance and accountability. Authorities took steps to communicate lessons learned without compromising the privacy of individuals involved. Reports summarized procedural successes, noting how careful monitoring, methodical record review, and coordinated oversight had been instrumental in identifying patterns that were initially subtle. These reports highlighted that early detection relies on observation, consistency, and patience, rather than reactive measures. For the public, this reinforced the principle that vigilance is often administrative and analytical, rather than dramatic or confrontational. One long-term effect involved changes to oversight protocols. Agencies reviewed how financial activity is monitored across commercial networks, especially when international connections are present. Minor procedural adjustments were implemented to improve clarity in documentation, streamline interagency communication, and ensure that recurring patterns could be detected sooner without imposing unnecessary scrutiny on lawful business activity. These refinements were framed as part of continuous improvement, demonstrating that even when a case is resolved, lessons can strengthen the broader system. Community awareness also benefited from educational initiatives. Local forums and guidance from regulatory bodies emphasized the importance of transparency in business operations. Residents and small business owners were encouraged to maintain accurate records and ensure that financial practices aligned with stated activities. This guidance was practical rather than punitive, aimed at preventing inadvertent discrepancies that could later require explanation. By framing it as a matter of good governance, authorities sought to reduce anxiety while fostering understanding. Despite the thorough investigation, some questions remained unanswered. Certain transactions and links could not be fully contextualized, largely because they involved closed or inactive entities. Analysts documented these gaps clearly, noting that absence of information does not imply wrongdoing, but rather highlights the limitations inherent in examining complex networks retrospectively. Acknowledging these gaps reinforced the investigative principle that transparency requires honesty about what is known and what is not. The human element was equally significant. Individuals involved in the case, both directly and indirectly, experienced scrutiny, legal proceedings, and in some instances, sentencing. While the focus of official reports remained on patterns and structures, the personal consequences were inevitably real. Authorities emphasized the distinction between accountability under law and public speculation, ensuring that narratives remained factual and respectful. For the community, this underscored that the justice system balances individual rights with broader societal protection. Financial recovery measures also implicated implications beyond immediate restitution. Recovered funds were reinvested into compliance programs, monitoring systems, and public awareness initiatives. This approach highlighted that accountability includes not only penalties, but also constructive steps to prevent recurrence. The community benefited indirectly through strengthened oversight and more robust mechanisms to safeguard lawful commerce. Reflection extended to policy considerations at a national level. While the case itself was one instance, regulators and enforcement agencies used it to examine risk factors associated with cross-border financial activity.
Policy discussions focused on how to maintain flexibility for legitimate trade while ensuring mechanisms exist to identify and address potential misuse. Lessons drawn were shared across departments and incorporated into training for analysts and officers, creating a culture of continuous learning. For residents of the town where the initial premises were located, the aftermath was both subtle and enduring. Streets continued to bustle with routine activity, shops opened and closed, and life unfolded without disruption. Yet awareness lingered, an understanding that beneath everyday transactions, oversight mechanisms operate silently to ensure integrity. This duality, ordinary life coexisting with careful supervision, became a quiet reassurance rather than a source of fear. In retrospect, the case serves as an illustration of balance, the importance of vigilance paired with restraint, the need for procedural patience, and the role of transparency in fostering trust. Investigators, legal advisors, and analysts worked within a framework designed to respect rights while pursuing clarity, demonstrating that complex financial networks can be examined responsibly, without sensationalism. The outcome, while measured and restrained, reinforced confidence in the system and highlighted the value of methodical oversight. Ultimately, the lessons extend beyond the specific case. They touch on broader principles relevant to communities, businesses, and regulatory institutions alike. Diligence, careful observation, and adherence to established standards are essential for maintaining integrity. Awareness and education, combined with proportionate enforcement, contribute to a stable environment in which ordinary life can continue safely. And so, in a quiet town where routines unfold with familiar predictability, the systems that ensure accountability remain largely unseen, yet profoundly present, reminding all who observe that beneath ordinary appearances, careful scrutiny preserves order, fairness, and the rule of law. If you want to follow more real UK cases and explore how investigations unfold, subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated with our latest episodes.